My name is Sarah, and for 12 years I believed I was married to a man who was simply ambitious and demanding. It took his father's death to reveal that I wasn't married to an ambitious man at all. I was married to a parasite who'd been living off family money while convincing me that I was the burden in our relationship. When the will was read and David discovered what his father really thought of him, his entire world collapsed in a single afternoon.
But mine?
Mine was just beginning. If you want to hear about a woman who discovered that sometimes the best revenge is simply letting someone dig their own grave, subscribe to the channel and hit like so more stories like this come out faster. I met David Harrison 12 years ago at a charity fundraiser in downtown Boston. I was 22, fresh out of college with a degree in art history and dreams of opening my own gallery someday. David was 28, confidently working the room in a perfectly tailored suit, talking about real estate investments and business acquisitions like he was already a mogul. "You have an interesting perspective on the Monet collection," he said, approaching me as I studied the auction catalog. "Most people just see pretty pictures, but you're talking about market trends and cultural significance." "Art is both emotional and financial," I replied. "The pieces that move people also tend to move markets."
Exactly.
You understand that everything valuable has multiple dimensions: aesthetic, historical, and monetary. Most people only see one. We talked for 2 hours about art, business, and the intersection of culture and commerce. David seemed genuinely interested in my ideas about starting a gallery, my knowledge of emerging artists, my vision for creating a space that would serve both collectors and the community. "You should meet my father," he said as the evening wound down. "He's a serious art collector, and he'd appreciate your insights." 3 months later, David proposed. Not with grand romantic gestures or passionate declarations of love, but with practical arguments about building something together, combining our complementary skills, creating a partnership that would benefit both our ambitions. "You have the artistic vision and cultural knowledge," he explained over dinner at an expensive restaurant I couldn't have afforded on my museum internship salary. "I have the business acumen and capital access. Together, we could build something significant." It sounded like a fairy tale. A partnership with someone who valued my intelligence and wanted to help me achieve my dreams. I was young enough to mistake calculated interest for love. The wedding was everything I dreamed of: elegant, sophisticated, held at the Harrison family estate in Beacon Hill. David's father, William Harrison, was old Boston money, the kind of wealth that came with ancestral portraits and inherited responsibilities. He welcomed me warmly, asking thoughtful questions about my gallery plans and promising to introduce me to other collectors who might become clients or investors. "David chose well," William told me during our first dance. "He needs someone with substance, someone who understands that true success requires more than just accumulating money." For the first 2 years of our marriage, David seemed supportive of my ambitions. He helped me research gallery locations, introduced me to potential investors, and encouraged me to start building relationships with emerging artists. We lived in a beautiful brownstone that David said was our first investment property, and I threw myself into making it a home while also developing my business plan. But gradually, the support began to feel more like management. David would review my business plans and suggest improvements that always seemed to make my role smaller and his larger. He'd introduce me to his contacts as my wife who's interested in art, rather than as a professional with her own expertise. When I mentioned wanting to take a loan to accelerate the gallery timeline, he'd shake his head and say, "Not yet. We need to be more strategic." By year 3, "We need to be more strategic" had become David's standard response to any initiative I proposed. The gallery remained a someday dream while David's real estate ventures seemed to multiply weekly. "I don't understand why you're in such a rush," he'd say when I expressed frustration about the delay. "We have time to do this right. My father's connections will be much more valuable once I've established myself more solidly in the business community." I started to notice that David's business ventures all seemed to involve his father's money. The real estate investments, the acquisition opportunities, the networking events, everything was funded by William Harrison's capital and connections. David was essentially playing business with someone else's chips while I waited for permission to start my own career. By year 5, David's attitude toward my ambitions had shifted from delay to dismissal. The gallery idea is nice, Sarah, but it's not realistic. Art galleries are vanity projects for wealthy women who want to feel important. You don't have the capital or connections to make it viable. Your father said he'd introduce me to collectors. My father was being polite. He's not going to jeopardize his relationships by endorsing an unproven venture run by someone with no business experience. I have a degree in art history and 3 years of museum experience, which qualifies you to work for someone else's gallery, not run your own. Be realistic about your limitations. The conversations became shorter and more dismissive over time. David was building his empire, or at least the appearance of one, and my dreams were becoming inconvenient obstacles to his vision of our life together. By year 7, I'd stopped bringing up the gallery altogether. David had made it clear that my role in our marriage was to support his ambitions, manage our home, and represent the Harrison name appropriately at social events. My own professional aspirations were selfish distractions from our shared goals. "You have everything you need," David would say when I seemed restless or dissatisfied. "A beautiful home, financial security, access to cultural events, and social circles you could never afford on your own. Most women would be grateful for what you have. I want to contribute something meaningful." "You do contribute. You manage our home beautifully. You're an asset at business dinners, and you'll be a wonderful mother when we're ready to start a family." That's not enough for you. It wasn't enough, but I'd learned that saying so would trigger lectures about gratitude and realism, and how lucky I was to have married into a family that could provide me with opportunities I'd never have achieved independently. The worst part wasn't the dismissal of my ambitions. It was the gradual erosion of my sense of my own capabilities. After years of being told that my ideas were impractical, my knowledge was shallow, and my independence was selfishness, I started to believe that maybe David was right. Maybe I was lucky just to be part of his success story. By year 10, I'd essentially become an expensive employee in my own marriage. I managed David's social calendar, decorated our homes. We'd acquired 2 more properties, and served as his +1 at events where he networked with other men while their wives discussed charity committees and vacation destinations. "Sarah's very artistic," David would tell people when introducing me, the same way someone might mention that their dog was well-trained. I'd stopped correcting people who assumed I'd never worked, stopped mentioning my education or museum experience, stopped pretending that I had any identity separate from being David Harrison's wife. The final transformation happened in year 11, when David's business ventures started requiring more of his father's financial backing. "Dad's increasing his investment in our projects," David announced over dinner one evening, "which means we need to be more careful about expenses and appearances. No more impulse purchases, no more expensive hobbies, and definitely no more talk about starting your own business. We can't afford any ventures that might lose money right now. What if the gallery could be profitable? It won't be. And frankly, Sarah, after 11 years, it's time to accept that you're not cut out for business ownership. You're good at supporting successful people, but you don't have the drive or skills to be successful yourself." That night, lying in bed next to a man who'd systematically convinced me that I was incapable of independent success, I realized that I'd traded my dreams for security and ended up with neither. The call came on a Tuesday morning in March. William Harrison had suffered a massive heart attack and died at his office, surrounded by the legal documents and financial statements that had defined his life. David was devastated, or at least he appeared to be. He threw himself into funeral planning with the same intensity he brought to business deals, coordinating with attorneys and accountants and family members to ensure that everything reflected the dignity and status William had maintained throughout his life. "Dad built something significant," David told me as we reviewed funeral arrangements. "And now it's my responsibility to carry on his legacy and grow what he started." I noticed that David spoke about inheriting his father's business empire like it was a foregone conclusion. He'd been the only child, the designated heir, the one who'd been groomed to take over the family investments and properties. "The will reading is scheduled for Friday," David's attorney informed us after the funeral. "It's fairly straightforward, but there are some specific bequests and instructions that need to be reviewed." David was confident about the outcome. Dad and I went over everything multiple times. The business assets, the real estate portfolio, the investment accounts. It's all structured to transfer to me with minimal tax implications. What about other family members? A few small bequests to cousins and charities, but the substantial assets come to me. Dad was very clear about wanting to keep the wealth concentrated rather than dispersed. Friday morning, we sat in the mahogany-paneled conference room of Harrison and Associates, the law firm that had managed the family's affairs for 3 generations. David wore his most expensive suit and the confident expression of someone about to inherit several $1,000,000. The attorney, Mr. Peterson, was an elderly man who'd known the Harrison family for decades. He opened the will with the usual legal formalities and began reading the specific bequests. To my cousin Margaret Harrison, I leave my collection of first edition books and the sum of $50,000. To the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, I leave my collection of 19th century American paintings and the sum of $100,000 for their preservation and display. To various charitable organizations. The list continued for several minutes, each bequest modest but thoughtful. David listened with polite attention, waiting for the significant portion of the will that would transfer the bulk of his father's wealth. To my son, David Harrison, Mr. Peterson continued, I leave the family home in Beacon Hill, the contents thereof, and the sum of $200,000. David smiled and nodded, assuming this was just the beginning of his inheritance. But Mr. Peterson kept reading. However, the remainder of my estate, including all business interests, real estate investments, stock portfolios, and liquid assets, totaling approximately $3.2 million, I leave to my daughter-in-law, Sarah Harrison. The words hung in the air like a physical presence. David's smile froze, then slowly dissolved into confusion. I'm sorry, could you repeat that? David asked. The bulk of your father's estate, approximately $3.2 million, has been left to your wife, Sarah. I felt like the floor had disappeared beneath my chair. This couldn't be right. William had barely spoken to me in the last few years, and when he had, the conversations had been polite but distant. There must be a mistake, David said, his voice rising. My father would never, we discussed this extensively. Everything was supposed to come to me. Mr. Peterson adjusted his glasses and continued reading. Your father included a letter explaining his decision. Would you like me to read it? Yes, I whispered, still trying to process what was happening. Mr. Peterson opened a sealed envelope and began to read in William Harrison's voice, as captured by his own words. To my son David and my daughter-in-law Sarah. David, I have watched you for 12 years as you built what you believed was a business empire using my money while taking credit for achievements that belong to my capital, not your capabilities. You have convinced yourself that you are a successful entrepreneur, but you have never risked your own resources, never failed and recovered, never built anything that wasn't funded by wealth you did not earn. David's face had gone completely white. More troubling to me has been your treatment of Sarah. I have watched you systematically undermine her confidence, dismiss her intelligence, and convince her that she is incapable of independent success. You have taken a bright, capable woman with genuine potential and turned her into a decorative accessory to your borrowed achievements. I started crying, but I wasn't sure if it was from relief, shock, or grief for the years I'd lost believing David's assessment of my worth. Sarah, you may not remember, but during your first year of marriage, you sent me a detailed business plan for an art gallery specializing in emerging contemporary artists. Your research was thorough, your financial projections were realistic, and your vision was both commercially viable and culturally valuable. When I mentioned it to David, he told me you'd abandoned the idea because you'd realized you weren't cut out for business. David was staring at the table, his jaw clenched so tightly I could see the muscles in his temples. I began paying closer attention to your marriage after that conversation. I watched David take credit for insights you'd shared with him about art and cultural trends. I watched him dismiss your ideas while implementing versions of them in his own ventures. I watched him convince you that you were lucky to be supported by his success, while he used my money to fund that success. Mr. Peterson paused and looked at both of us before continuing. David, You will inherit enough to maintain a comfortable lifestyle if you learn to live within your means and build something with your own efforts rather than my capital. Sarah, you will inherit the resources to build whatever life you choose, including the art gallery you never stopped wanting but were convinced you couldn't achieve. The letter concluded with specific instructions about the transition of assets and a final message. Sarah, your worth was never determined by David's opinion of you. I hope you'll use these resources to rediscover the ambitious, intelligent woman I met 12 years ago. The silence in the room was deafening. David sat motionless, staring at the legal documents that had just destroyed every assumption he'd held about his future. This is insane, he finally said, his voice barely controlled. My father couldn't have been thinking clearly when he wrote this. Sarah has no experience managing investments or business assets. She'll lose everything within 5 years. Your father was quite lucid when he updated his will, Mr. Peterson replied calmly. He consulted with multiple attorneys and financial advisors to ensure the transition would be structured properly. Updated? When did he update it? 18 months ago. He'd been considering this decision for several years. David turned to me, his expression a mixture of rage and desperation. Sarah, you can't seriously be considering accepting this. You don't know anything about managing this kind of wealth. You'll need my help, my business experience. Your business experience with your father's money? I asked quietly. That's different. I built something with those investments. You built something with his investments, using his capital, his connections, his reputation. What exactly did you contribute besides taking credit? David's face flushed red. I contributed years of work, strategic planning, relationship building. Using resources that were never yours. Taking credit for successes that belong to your father's wealth, not your abilities. For the first time in 12 years, I was seeing David clearly. Not as the successful businessman I'd married, but as a man who'd been playing with house money while convincing everyone, including himself, that he was a master player. You can't do this, David said, his voice becoming desperate. We're married. This affects both of us. You can't just take everything and leave me with nothing. I'm not taking anything. Your father left this to me. And he left you enough to build something real if you're actually capable of building anything. $200,000? That's nothing compared to what I was supposed to inherit. It's more than most people start with. And it's more than you've ever risked of your own money. David spent the next hour trying to convince Mr. Peterson that the will was invalid, that his father had been manipulated, that I had somehow influenced this decision. But the documentation was thorough, the legal structure was sound, and William Harrison had clearly been planning this transfer for years. Over the following weeks, as the estate transfer process moved forward, David's true character became impossible to ignore. The confident, successful businessman I'd married disappeared, replaced by someone bitter, desperate, and furious that his unearned advantages had been removed. You're making a huge mistake, he told me repeatedly. You don't understand how to manage wealth, how to maintain the lifestyle we've built, how to navigate the social and business relationships that come with this kind of money. Maybe I'll learn. You'll lose everything, and then you'll come crawling back, begging me to fix what you've destroyed. Maybe. Or maybe I'll discover that I'm more capable than you've spent 12 years telling me I am. The divorce proceedings were swift. David had no legal claim to inherited assets, and I had no interest in prolonging our relationship. He moved out of our Beacon Hill home, which now belonged to me as part of the inheritance, and into a small apartment in Cambridge. I spent the first month after David left just sitting in the house, trying to process the magnitude of what had changed. 12 years of being told I was incapable of independent success, and now I had the resources to pursue any dream I'd ever abandoned. The gallery was my first priority. I found a perfect space in the South End, spent 3 months renovating it to my specifications, and opened Emerging Visions 6 months after William's death. The opening reception featured works by 12 contemporary artists I'd been following for years, including several pieces I purchased with my own money rather than asking permission from someone who didn't understand their value. David attended the opening, uninvited but not unwelcome. I watched him move through the space, looking at price tags and attendance numbers, calculating the commercial success of something he'd told me I'd never be capable of achieving. "It's smaller than I expected," he said when he approached me near the end of the evening. "It's exactly the size I planned. The neighborhood's not ideal for serious collectors." The serious collectors seemed to be finding it just fine. David had spent the evening watching me interact with artists, collectors, and critics as someone with expertise and authority rather than as his decorative accessory. "Your father would have been proud," I told him as the evening wound down. "My father destroyed my life to make a point about yours. Your father gave you the same chance he gave me, the opportunity to build something real instead of just inheriting something unearned. I was supposed to inherit the business. I was groomed for it. You were groomed to manage someone else's wealth. There's a difference." David left without saying goodbye. I heard through mutual acquaintances that he'd taken a job with a commercial real estate firm, starting as a junior associate and earning a salary for the first time in his adult life. 2 years later, the gallery was profitable and expanding. I developed relationships with collectors and artists that had nothing to do with the Harrison name or inherited connections. I was traveling to art fairs and exhibitions, discovering new talent, and building something that reflected my own vision rather than someone else's resources. David sent me a letter on the second anniversary of his father's death. "Sarah," he wrote, "I've had time to think about everything that happened, and I want you to know that I understand now why my father made the decision he did. I spent 12 years living off his success while convincing myself that I was the architect of my own achievements. I spent 12 years undermining your confidence because I was afraid that if you succeeded independently, it would highlight how little I'd actually accomplished on my own." The letter continued for several pages, acknowledging the ways he'd diminished my ambitions and expressing regret for the years I'd lost believing his assessment of my capabilities. "I don't expect forgiveness," he concluded, "but I want you to know that watching what you've built with the gallery has shown me the difference between inherited opportunity and earned success. My father was right to give you the chance to discover what you were capable of achieving." I never responded to the letter, but I kept it as a reminder of how easily someone can convince you to abandon your own dreams if you let them define your worth. 5 years after William's death, I received an invitation to David's wedding. He was marrying a woman he'd met at his real estate firm, someone who'd built her own career and had her own ambitions. The invitation included a handwritten note. "Thank you for showing me that real partnership requires respecting each other's capabilities, not just managing each other's limitations." I attended the wedding, held in a small restaurant rather than a grand estate. David looked happier than I'd seen him in years, and his bride looked like someone who wouldn't tolerate being treated as a decorative accessory. During the reception, David approached me while his wife was talking with friends. "I want to thank you," he said. "For what?" "For not fighting the will. For not trying to share the inheritance with me out of guilt or obligation. If you had, I never would have learned what I was actually capable of achieving on my own." And what's that? Not as much as I thought, but more than I feared. Turns out I'm a decent real estate agent when I'm not trying to be a mogul. Your father would be proud of that. I think he would. He always said that honest work was more valuable than inherited wealth. David's new wife joined us, and we talked about the gallery, her marketing firm, and his real estate career. 3 people who'd all learned the difference between borrowed success and earned achievement. As I drove home that evening, I thought about the gallery opening I was planning for next month, featuring an artist I discovered whose work explored themes of transformation and second chances. The pieces were bold, unconventional, and absolutely beautiful, the kind of art that David would have called impractical, but that collectors were already requesting to preview. William Harrison had given me more than money when he changed his will. He'd given me the chance to discover that the woman David had convinced me I could never become was actually the woman I'd always been underneath 12 years of systematic undermining. The gallery now employed 6 people, represented 43 artists, and had been featured in 3 national art publications. I owned 2 properties, maintained an investment portfolio, and had learned to navigate the business and social relationships that came with independent success. But the most valuable thing I'd gained wasn't financial. It was the knowledge that my worth had never been determined by David's opinion of me, and my capabilities had never been limited by his assessment of my potential. Some people marry because they love each other. Some people marry because they love what the other person can provide for them. And some people marry because they're afraid of discovering what they're capable of achieving alone. David had been afraid that if I succeeded independently, his borrowed achievements would look less impressive by comparison. He'd been right to be afraid. William Harrison had spent 12 years watching his son undermine his daughter-in-law's confidence while taking credit for successes built on family money. He'd made a choice between enabling his son's delusions and empowering his daughter-in-law's potential. He chose to invest in the person who'd been underestimated rather than the person who'd been overestimated. And that investment paid returns that no amount of inherited wealth could have provided. The chance for someone to discover their own worth instead of accepting someone else's assessment of their limitations. The gallery is closed on Mondays, so I spend those days visiting studios, meeting new artists, and planning exhibitions that will introduce the world to talent that might otherwise go unrecognized. It's the work I'd dreamed of doing when I was 22 years old and believed that marriage meant partnership rather than subordination. William Harrison gave me the resources to remember who I'd been before I let someone else define who I could become. And that gift was worth more than $3.2 million, though the $3.2 million certainly helped make it possible.